Now we have a very interesting discussion about this upcoming NBA season. There are reports that this would be considered the 75th NBA season, but then we've also seen other reports saying that next season, the 21-22 NBA season would be considered the 75th NBA season. Either way, we're going to go ahead and talk about this upcoming season in a very different light and act like this is going to be the 75th NBA season. To really celebrate, we were trying to figure out how could we really pull this together and really talk about it and celebrate it. We're both NBA fans. We both played basketball way back when. We both love the NBA. We felt compelled to do on our show, on our podcast, is to talk about the things that we love. In this upcoming season, one of the NBA All-Star games, the 2017 NBA All-Star game, the Roots actually introduced the teams. So it was a pre-ceremony event that the Roots and also Black Thought. It was absolutely amazing. Tariq Trotter, aka Black Thought, was the one who came up with the lyrics. And there's one lyric, or a few lyrics that he said in that piece that I think would be very, very appropriate for this discussion. And so as they were playing and about to introduce the team, Tariq Trotter, aka Black Thought, this is what he said. We live in a culture that has always been obsessed with one age-old question. Who is the best? When was the best ever? Where was the best place? Who's the strongest? The fastest? The prettiest? The most stylistic? What is excellence? What is legendary? I mean, why do we even play? Define eminence. Who are the illustrious that elevated the sport to an art form? What is supremacy? What is greatness? And hearing that, I was like, man, I am so hyped. that is powerful. Mm-hmm. And that was just the beginning. And so as they go throughout the whole piece here, they go through each respective decade of the NBA. And for those of you that have not seen it, I highly recommend it. You can see this out at NBA History off of Twitter. It was so compelling because as they go through, they have different people introducing the decades, and it was really so cool. As they talk about the 50s and 60s, Bill Russell came to mind, right? Tariq said, that's a compelling argument. That's the foundation. That part of the foundation. Now, Dan and I, we weren't born. We weren't even thought of in the 50s and 60s. The only frame of reference we have of Bill Russell are just the highlights that we have seen. But then they go into like the 70s. They call it the era of style. The high socks and short shorts and the big hair, aka the afro. And so there's a few names that they mentioned in this musical, and they mentioned a Dave Thompson. They mentioned a Pistol Pete. They mentioned Black Jesus, Earl the Pearl Monroe. They mentioned World Be Free, Dr. J, Iceman, Kareem, Chocolate Thunder. Even mentioned the Rolls Royce of the backcourt. I was just like, man, first of all, the nicknames in the 70s was like no other. Yep. And that got me hyped, man. I was like, dang, when you start really to listen to the nicknames, come on, man. That's the 70s.
That was the time where the ABA transitioned into the NBA. So a lot of that style melded together, like the Dr. J's, the David Thompsons. They came from the ABA into the NBA. So you just have these images and thoughts of, you have Kareem establishing himself as one of the all-time greats during that era. Mm-hmm. The ABA brought that flair to the NBA because of all the dunking and the free flow of the game that the ABA had. And once Dr. J and all of them showed up, it changed the NBA holistically because they had just a different athleticism, a different way of playing ball, all these different things coming together during the 70s, which then led into the 80s.
Also in that introduction or the musical itself by the Roots, they mentioned that in the 70s, it introduced the alley-oop, the underhand shot, and the slam. That thing is amazing. And then they went into the 80s. They call that the superstar era. They even mentioned Showtime, Magic, Bird, Isaiah, Barkley, Dominique, the Mailman. They even mentioned McHale, but they also mentioned the pick and roll. They mentioned run and gun. And then they kind of went into the tail end of the 80s, or more so into the 90s, with Jordan, with Shaq, Elijah Wan, Pippen. They even mentioned Yao Ming, Kobe, AI, Penny, the Dream Team, Duncan. Major endorsements. They mentioned how it really evolved to major endorsements. They mentioned defense and offense. But going back to the 80s, you talk about legendary. You talking about, first of all, saving the NBA was Magic and Bird. That's why they're so beloved, because they saved the NBA. Just as we just talked about the 70s and everything, man, we cannot forget what Magic and Bird did for the NBA in the 80s. So you had your Lakers, Celtics, eventually the Pistons came on in. You had so the Sixers.
Yep.
And so yeah, the A's were just amazing, man.
First and second grade, I got the Basketball Digest. I would come home and be so hyped if I see it in the little tray at the apartment complex.
Yep.
And that put me on to so many players that people don't even realize right now. You can watch every game, any game, because of the ticket and all this. Back in that day, you didn't get that opportunity. So when I would see like a Bernard King, and people didn't know a lot about Bernard King. Bernard King could put in buckets. My boy Andrew Toney.
Buckets.
Andrew Toney. If he wouldn't have got hurt and he wouldn't have the bad feet, no telling what Andrew Toney played for the Sixers.
Defense.
Could shoot too. Handle.
Yep.
Mo Cheeks.
Yep.
That whole Sixers is the Sixers, Lakers, early Bucks. And you look at that too, and that's where, if you remember, they started doing commercials like the weapons.
Yep.
Before Jordan got hot, it was Larry Bird, Magic Johnson with those weapons commercials with those Converse.
Yeah. And Magic riding that limo out to French Lick.
That's where all the dynasties picked up again, because the 50s and 60s it was Celtics, Lakers, but then Lakers, Celtics, Pistons. At the end of the decade, the introduction of the slam dunk contest again, because back in the ABA they had it, and then they brought it back. And when Larry Nance was in there with the two basketballs, and Dr. Duncanstein, Darrell Griffin from Utah. So you just think of all the names, man, and all the memories that got us into basketball, and then propelled us into the 90s, where you think of too, that's where it started getting more and more commercialized and then the video games start coming out to introduce some people to more and more of these players and things. And that's where the game kind of slowed down a little bit, and it was rough and tough, and the Jordan rules, like we mentioned in the past, and Detroit owned it at the beginning, but then Jordan and them took over. Houston had those two back-to-back, and then it was Jordan and team again. The 80s and 90s decades in particular, it was just the jump-off point to propel it to where it is now in the 2000s.
And when you really think about the teams that we have now, the systems that we have, back then, Showtime. Like right now, I don't think there's like really a Showtime type system. When you think about what Showtime was really all about, run and gun, grab the rebound, push it up the floor, Magic runs the show. The only team I could see some similarities there would be obviously Golden State, but they were kind of like a similar to maybe the triangle a little bit, but you have two dynamic shooters and Clay and stuff. So yeah, it'll be really interesting. And I thought about this. It'll be really interesting to see how Jordan would have played in this era with the nutrition, the facilities. I think he would have given up a little bit of the cigar playing in this era, because when you think about this particular era now, just how athletic they are, and they were athletic in the 90s now, don't get me wrong. They were strong in the 90s too. Let's be real. Jordan didn't go through what he went through for nothing. I mean, Jordan rules, all that stuff. But it just would have been interesting to see Jordan in this particular era, and I think he still would have dominated, quite honestly, based upon the new rules and stuff like that. Really hand touching, or hey man, hand checks or whatever. Hey, Jordan went ahead and averaged about 40.
And that's, but then thinking of it the opposite way, putting LeBron back in the 90s.
Back there, yeah.
How would he have played in the league was different from where the centers dominated. Even like in the 90s too, I forgot to mention like Shaq. right? Shaq got introduced to the league, but it was center dominated. Now it's not that way. LeBron, think of him playing against the Knicks or the Heat.
Man, please.
In the mid-90s. And he's a big dude. So I just think it would have impacted his game, or he would have had to play a different way, where he couldn't have played bully ball as much because those dudes were just as big as him.
Oh, he definitely couldn't play bully ball.
Versus now, man, some of the dudes he goes against, he just bump into them, they fly across the lane. Versus that game, there are a lot hand checking. The way they call fouls was totally different. So
totally different.
Jordan being teleported into the 2020 game versus LeBron being teleported back into the 90s. Definitely some compelling arguments in how they would react to the game, because they're totally different games.
Yep, agreed there. Please go out to, and it's called The Roots Presents The Evolution of Greatness. That was, again, out of the 2017 NBA All-Star Game. A phenomenal depiction here of the NBA throughout its history. They did a phenomenal job, and again, have to give major credit to Tariq Trotter, aka Black Thought, from The Roots. And one of his final lyrics was, "Who really is the greatest? None of them are. In chasing ghosts of the past, we give birth to the present. True greatness is not comparison, it's evolution. Without each era, the game wouldn't be elevated to where it is today." And then they all kind of wrap up and say, greatness is simplicity, style, superstar, power. Greatness is here and now. And when they say greatness is simplicity, kind of going back into the 50s and 60s, style, the 70s, superstar, 80s, into the 90s, and power, 90s on. These were some excellent lyrics. I gotta give him mad props and to The Roots. In celebration of the upcoming NBA season, we had to do something. We had to pay homage to the NBA. And again, we have to give major credit to The Roots, who The Roots presents The Evolution of Greatness. So we have to give major props to Tariq Trotter, aka Black Thought, and the Roots family. Thank you for joining us at Back Porch Talk Podcast. You can also join us on Twitter by tweeting us at @back_podcast. For more information, you can go to our website, which is backporchtalkpodcast.com. You can also email us at backporchtalkpodcast@gmail.com. Again, thank you for joining us, and remember that there's enough hate in the world, so go ahead and spread a little love.